certifies the atmosphere.
So
I did it
Do you have any questions?
All right, perfect. You all set?
this is great. Absolutely.
Everybody good? All right. This hearing will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Good morning to everybody and welcome to today's hearing, which is called How the Domestic Nuclear Industry Boosts Local Economies, Curbs Emissions, and Strengthens National Security. I am Representative Connor Lamb of Pennsylvania's 17th District, covering Beaver County, where we are now. And I'd like to begin first by welcoming all of the guests who have traveled here from outside of Western Pennsylvania to visit us today. We are lucky to have several of my colleagues from the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology who will introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their districts as you go on, but they come from the great states of Illinois and Michigan. I want to thank you for taking the time to visit us here and learn about our local nuclear power issues. I also really want to thank our witnesses, who we are going to introduce individually as well, and you'll be hearing a lot from them today. But they have devoted their immense intellectual resources and energies to this problem that affects us and hits us really close to home here. So on behalf of all the people that I represent, especially here in Beaver County, but really all over Western Pennsylvania, I just want to thank all of you for taking an interest in us and spending some time here today. I also want to recognize we have two of our local government officials with us here, Commissioners Dan Camp and Tony Amadeo from Beaver County, who have done a lot to fight for the people working at this plant and all over Beaver County, and we're happy that you were able to take time to be with us today. We have represented as well some of our state office holders. I know State Representative Rob Matze, who's an active member of the Nuclear Caucus in Harrisburg, would love to be here, and he has done a lot to carry the fight for you in Harrisburg, so I just want to recognize his work. We have a representative from State Senator Elder Vogel as well, who is in the trenches with us on this one, and we really appreciate their efforts and their ability to follow us here today. We also have several of our tradesmen and women from IBEW's Local 712 and 29, and I really want to thank them for taking some time. We have a representative of the Painters Union, and it's very good of you to come here and remind us all that at the heart of all of this are the jobs that are providing for families here in Beaver County and outside of it. Really all over the region, tradesmen and women come and they operate and maintain and upgrade this plant, and we have to always remember that. Where we are right now today, we're holding this hearing here because we're in the shadow of the first ever civilian nuclear power plant in the United States. That started right here in Western Pennsylvania. And I think it's very important for us to remember that there was a time in World War II and shortly after where we were bold and adventurous enough to do something that at that time people actually thought was impossible. No one would have believed just a few years before this place was built that it was possible to take a weapon of war, which is how people thought of nuclear energy, and turn it into an instrument of peace. But President Eisenhower knew that that could be done. He knew that it had to be done. And I think we should all feel an immense pride as Western Pennsylvanians that when it came time to do this, President Eisenhower chose Shippingport here in Beaver County for that project. A lot of people know that Pittsburgh was already famous for contributing to the war effort through the steel industry, but not a lot of people know that we are the leaders in nuclear power as well. And it's amazing. I think in some ways we can feel even more pride about our nuclear heritage because, you know, steel, it came in large ways because we had things in the ground in Western Pennsylvania that nobody else had, and we had a river system and all that kind of thing. The nuclear industry, it wasn't because of something specific that we only had here. But I think President Eisenhower knew about the power of our scientific and research community as represented by the Bettis Atomic Power Lab and our incredible businesses, Duquesne Light and Westinghouse, and most importantly, the abilities and courage of our people. They knew that they could get the job done. And so that's why I think many of us are so proud. When this first started in the 50s, people were very uneasy about the idea of civilian nuclear power in their backyard. And I read that people were asking whether their light bulbs would burn twice as bright in their homes once the power started coming from nuclear energy, because they just thought it was that scary and powerful. But people took the risk here anyway. And what is incredible is since then, since construction began, I believe in 1954, generations of members of the same families, of hardworking tradesmen and women, of engineers, of scientists, of nuclear officers, have worked to not only maintain these plants, but to upgrade them, rebuild them, and now the Beaver Valley nuclear station that has replaced Shippingport, it's one of the safest and most reliable power plants of anywhere in the world. It regularly scores among the tops in Pennsylvania and in the country, and that is solely due to the dedication and professionalism of the men and women that work there. And we got a chance to see that on our way here today. I want to thank the First Energy folks for taking us on such a great tour and for doing such an amazing job running that plant. Unfortunately today, times have changed a little bit compared to the 50s and 60s when this all got underway. And the Beaver Valley station, many of you know, is scheduled to close in 2021 if we don't do something. And I want to repeat that. It's not just at risk of closing, it is scheduled to close. There are many reasons for that, but the fact remains that those thousands and thousands of people that worked so hard to build this industry here in our backyard, worked so hard to provide power for all of us, provide for their own families, and contribute to the national security of this country, they deserve a lot better than to see their life's work go under in just a couple short years when that's avoidable. That does not have to be the outcome. And I think right now that their work has never been more important. See, the electricity that is produced at Beaver Valley is completely carbon-free. And because of the nuclear industry in Pennsylvania, we actually get 40% of our power across the state from nuclear energy. Carbon-free power, 40%. It makes us a leader in the United States. I'm always struck by the fact that many of our friends and neighbors don't know that this nuclear industry is such a huge part of our economy, and that we're already getting 40% of our power carbon-free because of its contribution. If we allow these plants to go under, a lot of that power, if not all of it, will be replaced by fossil fuels. We will never reach our goals when it comes to the climate and the environment if we allow nuclear energy to collapse. The reason I talked about President Eisenhower today, and if you look over to the right here, you're going to see a picture of him waving this magic wand when they started construction of the power plant. He was so proud that this was his baby, this was his darling, that he supervised the construction of it from beginning to end. He is remembered for that level of focus and attention to detail in winning the war in World War II and then preserving the peace and building our national infrastructure like this plant. And back then, people knew that all those things were related. And that's what we're going to talk about here today, how it's not just about the local economy and local power, but it's about the national security of the entire United States, why we have to preserve this industry. And I think if we could bring President Eisenhower back today and ask him how he would address the challenges of the 21st century after he was so successful meeting the challenges of the 20th, I think he would recognize them and he would say, you've got to build and preserve this infrastructure again. You've got to renew it for a new century. And new challenges like climate change, and that we cannot afford to let these things go under. So that's why we're really here today. We're here to talk about how we protect these jobs for our tradesmen and women, for our veterans. So many of the employees in the nuclear industry are veterans of the U.S. Navy's nuclear program, for our scientists. And finally, the issue that we'll touch on in a little more detail is how there are going to be many nuclear power plants built overseas in the decades to come. There's about 1 billion people in the world today that still don't have electricity. And when our competitor nations like Russia and China look at that fact, they see a market. They see a market worth hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars to build these plants, to make all the parts that supply them, to send their scientists and people overseas to build them. The United States used to think that way. We used to go overseas and share our technology. In fact, there were people from the Shippingport plant here that went to Japan in the 1960s to help them build their nuclear power. That is world leadership, and that's making sure that this technology is done right. We can get back to that way of thinking again. There's no way that we can't, but there's a lot we need to do. So that's what we're here to talk about today. If there are any members who wish to add their own additional opening statements to the record, you can do so at this point. Not seeing any, I would like to introduce our witnesses so everyone knows who we have with us today. And we are extremely lucky to have this panel with us. So I'll start with Dr. Pete Lyons, who's a former Department of Energy Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Energy and also a former commissioner at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. He was nominated by President Obama and confirmed by the Senate as Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Energy in 2011. Before being at the Department of Energy, Dr. Lyons was appointed by President Bush as a commissioner at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in 2005. So he's served under multiple administrations. He now consults on several corporate and laboratory boards, and he assists several international groups. We're very thankful to him for traveling all the way from Colorado to be with us here today. Next to Dr. Lyons, we have Admiral William Fallon, who's retired from the United States Navy after a 40-year career of military and strategic leadership. He has previously held the positions of the Commander of U.S. Central Command and U.S. Pacific Command, Presidential Envoy to Japan, and Vice Chief of the Navy. I believe he was Vice Chief of the Navy on September 11th, 2001, and personally led some of the response that our nation had on that day and afterward. He currently serves on many defense boards and consults in Washington, D.C., and we're incredibly thankful to have him with us today as well. Next to Admiral Fallon is Ms. Tina Taylor, who is the Deputy Chief Nuclear Officer and Senior Director of Research and Development at the Electric Power Research Institute. She's responsible for a wide array of research addressing the most technically challenging issues facing nuclear power. And her team is responsible for work in the areas of maintenance, engineering, equipment reliability, instrumentation and control, risk and safety management, all the things that make these nuclear power plants actually work and be safe. Ms. Taylor can talk to us about today, including what it takes to decommission some of these plants. Next to Ms. Taylor is a hometown boy, Dr. J Apt, who's a professor at the Tepper School of Business and Department of Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. He is also the co-director of the Carnegie Mellon Electricity Industry Center, which is actually one of the world's largest engineering business center focused on the electric industry. He's a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He received the NASA Distinguished Service Medal and the Metcalf Lifetime Achievement Award for significant contributions to engineering. He's also an astronaut by trade, and we'll be talking about a wide array of things as they relate to nuclear power for us today. So, as our witnesses should know, you will each have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony has already been included in the record of this hearing, and when you have completed your spoken testimony, we will begin with questions from the members. We will probably do multiple 5-minute rounds of questions, so you'll have a chance to share everything that you have to share with us today. Again, I'm just incredibly thankful to have you here with us, and we will start now with Dr. Pete Lyons.
Thank you, Chairman Lamb, and also Representatives Stevens, Foster, and Caston. It's really an honor to testify in today's hearing. I guess that is on. As you just heard, I retired as the Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Energy after prior service as a Commissioner of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and also many years as a Science Advisor on U.S. Senate staff. I also held many positions at Los Alamos National Laboratory in many decades there. In retirement, I've co-chaired the American Nuclear Society's Committee on Nuclear in the States, which published a toolkit to provide states with options to protect their nuclear plants. We also published the U.S. Without Nuclear Energy, a report on the public impact of plant closures. I now serve as a subcommittee co-chairman for the Energy Department's Nuclear Energy Advisory Committee. Their recent recommendation from that subcommittee was that policy changes are essential to assure survival of the existing fleet of the U.S. commercial nuclear plants. Our nuclear power plants, the most resilient component of our nation's electrical grid, represent a vital national resource. Former Governor Ridge has said that the goal of grid reliance cannot be met without nuclear power. When the 18-month fuel supply at a typical nuclear plant is contrasted with needs for constant coal shipments or operating gas pipelines, the role of nuclear power is simply beyond question. They provide confidence that power will be available as needed. They also contribute nationally about $2 billion in state taxes, $10 billion in federal taxes, and add about $60 billion to the nation's GDP. In 2018, the national average for nuclear generation cost was 3.2 cents per kilowatt hour, very low. But even that low price isn't always sufficient for profitability when nuclear energy's attributes are not compensated by electricity market structures. Low gas prices are impacting economic sustainability of nuclear power plants and state mandates for intermittent renewable energy, plus federal and state tax benefits for renewables, have further undermined the economics of nuclear power. These factors are leading some nuclear plants to close. More early closures could force closure of all, I'll say all, our nuclear power plants. Closure of nuclear plants, as you said, increases fossil fuel use and emissions. Nuclear plants provide more than half of our nation's emission-free electricity, enabling clean air and addressing climate change. Energy Secretary Perry has said, "I don't know how anybody who cares about the climate can't be for nuclear energy." In Pennsylvania, your nuclear plants provide 42% of your electricity and about 94% of your clean energy. There are 5,000 workers in your nuclear plants, with over 500 companies in Pennsylvania supporting the nuclear industry. Your governor issued an order to slash emissions. If your plants close, that won't happen, and Pennsylvania would be transformed from a power exporter to a power importer. Your Nuclear Energy Caucus reported that your nuclear plants reduced annual electric bills in Pennsylvania by about $800 million. Unfortunately, whenever preservation of nuclear power assets is discussed, it's fought by natural gas and sometimes by renewable companies, despite the fact that a diverse energy supply is absolutely vital to consumers. When these groups argue against nuclear power, in my mind, they are certainly not arguing in the best interests of the public. Fuel diversity is an essential, necessary requirement for a stable grid. Former Governor Ridge noted, "Only an electric grid built on diverse and stable sources of energy can withstand evolving threats and make sure the lights stay on." Our nuclear power plants also provide vital national security benefits. Our nuclear navy and weapons programs are supported by the infrastructure of nuclear power. In addition, when U.S. companies export their designs and expertise, they also export U.S. safety and non-proliferation standards. But now, international construction is being dominated by Russia and China, so they will be setting future international safety and non-proliferation norms, and the U.S. loses influence and jobs. Pennsylvania legislators are considering two important bills to preserve your nuclear power. As one deeply concerned about the energy future we leave for our children and grandchildren, it's my sincere hope that the ideas in these bills enable a future for nuclear energy in Pennsylvania. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lyons. Admiral Fallon.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, it's a great pleasure and honor to be here, and I would appreciate my written testimony being entered into the record. If I could, I'd just like to take a few minutes to share a couple of ideas with you. First, I guess I'm here as a private citizen. I'm not in any way representing any of the industry folks whatsoever, but I do have 4 decades plus of experience in the United States Navy, and much of that operating from an aviator in my distant past, flying from aircraft carriers that were nuclear powered for the last 30 or so years. And I think it would be good for us to recall some things that went on back in those early days. And you mentioned President Eisenhower, Mr. Chairman. You've got a mugshot of the president. When I was a young second grader, I met him when he was running for office in 1952. I know that's why they call me the Craggy Admiral. But I want to just give a perspective of those days. And so in the early 50s, when you talked about atomic anything, it was weapons. And this increasing threat of atomic war, we had already used these weapons, the Russians had them, the Chinese had just acquired them, was pervasive. Eisenhower had the vision and the drive to want to do something else. And he saw the potential, as technology was developing options, to actually use this, what we call nuclear power, this atomic power, for other things, peaceful things, because he knew the world needed help. And one of the things every place in the world needed, this country and others, was electric power. And the potential to have nuclear energy turned into power was very appealing, but needed a lot of development work. The United States Navy at the same time was thinking seriously about this. So from my experience in the Navy, I can tell you that the advent of nuclear power has given the U.S. Navy a phenomenal ability to operate in ways that it could only have dreamed about in the early days. It provides a tremendous opportunity to give a deterrent, a strategic deterrent for this country in the form of our ballistic missile submarines that's just unequaled in the world. And our aircraft carriers, all of which are nuclear powered now, not only help in that deterrent, but have a phenomenal striking capability should they be needed. So just a little sea story. In 1980, I was on the aircraft carrier USS Dwight D. Eisenhower. We were deployed to the Indian Ocean, and we, for many reasons, ended up remaining at sea for 152 straight days, 5 months operating continuously. Never been approached in terms of records back to World War II, and in fact, it's only been broken once by another former flagship of mine. Theodore Roosevelt actually went to 160 days, but this is a lot of time at sea. So tying things together, President Eisenhower came here and formally opened this plan. He had the vision, and since that time, in the early days, by the way, did you know that the person that was in charge of design and construction of this facility here at Shippingport was the same person that was the father of the nuclear navy, Admiral Hyman Rickover. And Rickover was intentionally put in charge of this operation because he was the kind of guy that got stuff done. We could use him today, I think, to help us along. But since those days, the Navy and the commercial nuclear industry have been intertwined in innumerable ways. And in fact, that's the crux of the problem that I see today. The decline of the commercial side is severely affecting the U.S. Navy, and it's affecting our national security. The network of infrastructure that supports both the commercial and the Navy side are difficult to distinguish. The supply chain that enables the operation of these plants. By the way, there are only about 200 nuclear reactors in our entire country. Half of those are on Navy ships, and the other half, declining numbers, are in our commercial plants. As someone already mentioned, the people that enable this industry to keep going and the people that enable our Navy to operate are often one and the same. And if you took a poll of people that are working in the commercial industry, you'd find an awful lot of Navy people. But we get people in the Navy, interestingly enough, because when people are young, they look down the road and they say, hey, what am I going to do? You know, I'm in the Navy 20, 25 years, and then what? And there's a good sharing. The situation of today is not good. We are strategically ceding the initiative to increasingly to Russia and China. As Congressman Lamb already mentioned, these two countries alone have under construction or in planning more than 200 nuclear power plants today. The United States, 0. The Russians have $130 billion of signed orders to build plants. We have not a penny, nothing. There's something wrong with this picture. So let's go back to Eisenhower's ideas. He had a vision. He thought that he could promote peace and stability. And the objectives of that program that he started and made a speech in front of the UN, it was known as the Atoms for Peace Initiative, had 3 cornerstone ideas. One was to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. How did that happen? Because Eisenhower, and by the way, there was a lot of staff disagreement, a tremendous amount of angst in Washington, better not do this, oh, it's dangerous, you're going to spread this technology, really bad, but he prevailed. He wanted to limit the spread of nuclear weapons because when the countries agreed to take the technology, they also had to agree to non-proliferate. Second thing, it enshrined the U.S. as the leader in, as Dr. Lyons already indicated, U.S. safety standards, U.S. procedures, U.S. technology in an agreed, regulated format that is certainly not the case with our adversaries in the world today. And the third thing is it enabled this country to develop relationships with other countries that are long-standing. So these nuclear plants are built to last 50 to 100 years. For the duration of these arrangements in other countries, you need people working together, trusting one another, technology exchange. That's all disappearing now as we've just kind of walked away from this thing. So for these key reasons, I think that this country needs to really step back and do some serious thinking. It isn't just about local clean energy, which ought to be very important to everybody. Solar, wind, nuclear are not the same. The sun doesn't shine 24 hours a day. The wind doesn't blow, but the 95% or better availability of nuclear power is, and I think it's something that we need to consider. We need to use our heads. We need a balance. And this balance at the domestic local level is really important, but in the strategic international level for national security, it's really important. And we need to get back in the program, in my opinion. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Admiral.
Your questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Taylor.
Good morning, Chairman Lamb and members of this subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in today's hearing. EPRI conducts research relating to the generation, delivery, and use of electricity for the benefit of the public. An independent nonprofit organization, we bring together experts to help address challenges in electricity, including reliability, efficiency, affordability, health, safety, and the environment. EPRI sees a plausible future where deep carbon reductions will require continued focus on energy efficiency, cleaner energy, electrification, and advanced fuels. Nuclear power plays an important role to achieve carbon reductions while providing affordable energy and a strong GDP. As was mentioned, it's fitting that we're here next to the Shippingport station today, the first demonstration of large-scale commercial nuclear power in the U.S. After 25 years of operation, Shippingport has been decommissioned successfully and the land released for unrestricted use. Currently operating at the site are the 2 units at Beaver Valley that you toured this morning. While both of these units have received license extensions from the NRC, First Energy has announced potential premature closure due to market challenges, and today Beaver Valley's future remains uncertain. Nuclear plants have long been valued for their reliable operation and contribution to baseload generation, and now they're being reappraised as a foundation for sustained decarbonization, economic contributions, environmental footprint, and other societal benefits. The 98 operating reactors today provide nearly 20% of the electricity in the U.S., and even with rapid deployment of wind and solar, nuclear plants still comprise about 60% of our carbon-free electricity. While a number of units in the U.S. are currently under financial stress, that picture can change dramatically if the U.S. places even a modest value on carbon reductions. The current nuclear fleet operates safely and has achieved very high reliability. The extended operation could provide an important foundation for the future of nuclear. Plants were initially licensed for 40 years from the NRC, with the potential for extended license periods of 20 years. Currently, 90 of the operating reactors have received license extensions to operate out to 60 years. The focus now is on renewal of these licenses to allow operation out to 80 years. So far, 3 companies have applied to the NRC for these second license extensions, and other companies are evaluating this option. Based on extensive research, evaluation of inspection results, and development of aging management programs, we have found no technical barriers to safely and reliably extending the life of these plants out to 80 years and potentially beyond. New technologies and process improvements can also enable extended operations, providing improved economics while maintaining reliability and safety. 2 examples of this are accident-tolerant fuel and plant modernization. Acceleration of these technologies can increase efficiencies, and EPRI is engaged with the Department of Energy and others to evaluate these options. The longer and more efficient operation of today's fleet provides a bridge to the next wave of nuclear technologies. This is important to provide additional time for development and deployment of new plant types and to help maintain the national nuclear expertise, as the Admiral discussed, and the supply chain. SMRs are a likely near-term option. EPRI has worked with stakeholders to accelerate adoption of these technologies, leverage the improvements in design, and is demonstrating advanced manufacturing technologies. Increasing industry and government interest in advanced reactors has coincided with an unprecedented influx of private investment. We're working on advanced reactor owner-operator requirements, developing methods for integrating safety assessments during the design phase, and performing economic modeling to explore where these plants may fit in the future. Opportunities for nuclear power increase substantially if decarbonization of transportation, building, and industrial sectors is seriously pursued via economy-wide electrification or through low-carbon energy carriers such as hydrogen. In conclusion, research and development to optimize and extend the life of existing plants and demonstrations of advanced nuclear technologies offer utilities and other stakeholders several options for reliable, efficient, carbon-free energy. Thank you again, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Taylor. And Dr. Abt.
Thanks very much, Chairman Lamb, other members of the committee, for giving me the opportunity to testify. I'm going to talk about something that we haven't talked about directly here, and that is non-carbon pollution. We're still killing prematurely 10,000 people a year from conventional pollutants from the power industry. We used to be killing 40,000 when I was growing up, and it's down. But the levels of pollution that we have from conventional power plants are still responsible for shortening your life expectancy by 6 months. Federal and state policies have made a pretty big difference in making that a lot better. I think that we need to keep doing that at both the federal and the state level. Much of the discourse about low pollution power has focused on renewables, but renewable and low pollution are not synonyms. As folks have said, nuclear provides about 19% of the low pollution power in this country. Renewables provide about 17%. Renewable energy resources are what I've spent a long period of my research career studying, and they're a key part of the nation's future. But look, if demand for electric power stays where it's been since 2007, all of the renewable sources taken together, wind, solar, hydroelectric, geothermal together, all would account for about 35% of U.S. electric generation by 2030. That's good, but if the nuclear plants close by 2030, the net effect would be we'd be right where we are now. If the nuclear plants stay open, we'd be at about 55% low pollution power. If the nuclear plants close, we'd be back down to 35% right where we are today. So I'd like to make the following points. As other folks have said, nuclear generation provides a bit over half of the low pollution power that we have in the country. The remaining half is provided by hydroelectric, wind, solar, and geothermal. Wind and solar are growing, but if the USA's nuclear plants close, say by 2030, the net effect would be no increase at all in our low pollution power. States have a big role to play. The U.S. Supreme Court's decision on April 15th to allow low pollution programs to go forward in Illinois and New York are a clear indication that states can treat low pollution power the same way that they treat renewable power. Let me move to the federal role. Spent fuel storage for civilian and military reactors is a federal responsibility. Funds have been collected from each kilowatt hour produced by our nation's nuclear power generators to pay for a long-term spent fuel solution. The federal government must shoulder its responsibility. The Department of Energy is a bunch of great national labs. They have excellent expertise in the material science that's relevant to the continued operation of the fleet of nuclear generators. Continuing DOE research into the ways that nuclear fuel elements, for example, can become more tolerant of transient temperature excursions is one appropriate area for federal action. Finally, if we're going to have safe and affordable advanced reactor designs that can be deployed at scale by mid-century, the United States is going to need to dramatically increase and refocus the budget of DOE's Office of Nuclear Energy towards advanced reactor development. The DOE's nuclear energy efforts have been scattered. They need to be centralized, and that may mean some difficult choices, like the ones that we made in the base realignment and closings for our military services to refocus those appropriately. Part of that increased budget would be dedicated to building new infrastructure, such as fast flux test facilities and other system test beds. Even with a higher budget, surge funding may be needed to get reactor development and programs to commercialization. We're going to have to down select to 2 or 3 real designs and commercialize those. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on this important matter, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions when the time comes.
Thank you, Dr. Abt. Okay, so just to explain for a second what we're going to do now, in case this wasn't already clear, this is a real legislative hearing the same way that we would conduct one on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. We just happened to bring it out here so that more folks could find out what we were thinking and we could learn from all of you. So when we hold these hearings in Washington, we will take testimony from the witnesses like we just did, and then the members get the chance to ask questions. And it's all designed to lead to a bill that we might draft or a law that we could try to pass on this subject. We're trying to gather the information from the experts themselves. So that's what we'll start to do now. I will recognize myself as the chairman of the subcommittee for about 5 minutes of questioning, and then we'll go through each member for 5 minutes, and we might do that a couple times to make sure all the questions get out. So I will start on the end with Dr. Lyons. Dr. Lyons, we have here today 4 members of Congress from this committee, all of whom happen to be Democrats. That's really mainly driven by just the logistics of traveling here and who was available and that kind of thing. I know from working on the committee that Democrats and Republicans are both very interested in nuclear power. And I thought you might be able to weigh in on that as someone who served in both President Bush's administration and President Obama's administration. And you actually quoted, in case anyone didn't catch who you were talking about, you quoted Department of Energy Secretary Rick Perry, the former Republican governor of Texas and presidential candidate, who himself has made very supportive comments about nuclear energy. So I was wondering if you could just weigh in your experience, has this been a bipartisan issue?
Chairman Lamb, I would very much agree with you that this is a bipartisan issue. I think it's well recognized in both houses and both parties that nuclear energy is a vital resource for the country. So yes, I strongly agree with you.
Great, thank you very much. Now, Admiral Fallon, I'd like to follow up on a few of the important things you discussed. One thing is, you talked a lot about aircraft carriers. Just very quickly, can we think of the aircraft carriers, they're almost sort of like floating nuclear power plants in a way, right? I mean, people think of nuclear energy and nuclear power as being very dangerous and risky, but actually the Navy has been doing this for a really long time, carrying them all over the ocean for long periods of time like you talked about, and there's a whole culture of safety and expertise that's built up. Could you talk about that a little bit? Sure,
I'm happy to. So the Navy's got more than 6 decades of operating experience under often extreme conditions, and it's been able to do it safely and efficiently and effectively. And a lot of that's a legacy of the same Admiral Rickover that was the instigator of this plan here. He had a well-appreciated, fearsome reputation in the Navy when I served as chief torturer, but his standards were at the highest level. And he insisted on these standards being enforced. And the legacy of that is what pervades the U.S. nuclear industry to this day, and in my opinion, needs to be expended out in the world rather than having Chernobyl and like situations perpetrated. So I think it's really important. Another comment about the floating power plant. So today's aircraft carriers have 2 reactors on them. The original carrier Enterprise had 8. We've learned a lot and moved the technology forward. But these plants operate for very long periods of time. The planned lifetime of our aircraft carriers since inception, the nuclear carriers, is 50 years. So Enterprise served 53 years. And the expectation is that we're going to continue that. So these are actually very versatile vessels. They're large and you can use them for many things. And the idea is we expect technology is going to change. The nature of conflict will change, but you have a platform that offers you immense varied capabilities, and I think it's really terrific. Submarines, a little more focused, smaller, but they're our primary strategic deterrent, lest anyone get an idea that they might do something stupid against this country. They're out there 24 hours a day, under the seas, very difficult to find, and they're enabled to do that by nuclear power, which keeps them going. So,
and it's that culture of professionalism and safety in the Navy.
Basically, the standards are very high, and there's not a lot of tolerance for error. And if you make a mistake, you're gone. But there's a very, very tightly interwoven series of events and activities and procedures in place to check and double check and make sure these things are done correctly and efficiently and safely.
Thank you. Do we happen to have any Navy veterans in the room with us today? I see a bunch of hands. Thank you for serving in the Navy. It's a shame you couldn't be in the Marine Corps, but the Navy is certainly a good option. But no, when you walk through the power plant here, I was struck both times I've been there by how many Navy veterans you meet who got their start in the Navy's nuclear program, and then they knew that they could move back home at the end of their service when they were ready. Many of them are from here originally and continue to work in the same field, and that's one of the great benefits of this industry. So with that, I will turn now to my colleague from Michigan, Representative Haley Stevens, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you. Well, allow me to say what a delight it is to be in Beaver County, in Shippingport in particular, with my incredible colleague and our chairman, Connor Lamb. We've got to give him some credit for his leadership in bringing this field hearing together and allowing us to have this discussion. We often talk about the Science Committee as the committee of the future and how we determine our future and come together to win it. And I represent communities not too different than this industrial Midwestern heartland. And the questions before us around our future, around a clean and sustainable economy that is creating jobs at scale for all of us, this is what Beaver County represents. And you have my commitment in partnership that will be damned if we let this plant close. And we will continue to work to share the success story about what the industrial might, what the workforce talent here represents, and frankly, how American leadership can be represented in new economies of scale because of what nuclear energy represents. My first question is for you, Dr. Lyons. In your testimony, you described the nation's nuclear power plants as a vital resource, and in my home state of Michigan, we generate nearly 90% of our emissions-free electricity from nuclear power. These are companies, DTE Energy and Consumers. We, frankly, are leaders in this space, and we're thrilled to be connected to all of you here in Beaver County because of that. This is also well over the national average of 55%. Can we just hone in here a little bit more specifically, though, because if plants like this, which, by the way, I had a blast on the tour, and I can't wait to come back, but if plants like this were to close, what would the national energy mix look like? What would this do to our energy economy?
Thank you for the question, Representative Stevens. As I indicated in my testimony, I'm concerned that as we continue to lose plants, we may, if you will, reach a cliff where we lose all of our nuclear power plants. The implications are tremendous. I mean, we would be losing over half of our clean energy in the country. There would be a dramatic reduction in the resilience and reliability of the grid. These are factors that are of immense importance to the American public. So I certainly agree with the thrust of your question. I used the word that they're a vital national resource. I absolutely believe that, and appreciate your question.
And so could you just explain a little bit more too about how this would impact our greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, there, if you will, have been a number of test cases around the country and around the world where nuclear plants have closed. They have always been primarily replaced with fossil energy, with the resulting emissions. So it's very hard to argue any other way. The emissions will increase dramatically, and the concerns that Dr. Abt raised in his testimony will be intensified with the impact of greater fossil emissions.
And we talked a little bit about the perception of nuclear energy and kind of going into a rich history of which we celebrate and recognizing some of the present day frustrations with how the public perceives nuclear energy. I almost want to save this for the second round, but I'll just say that one of my favorite thinkers of all time, Dr. Steven Pinker, in partnership with Dr. Josh Goldstein, at the top of April, published an opinion editorial piece titled, "How Nuclear Energy Can Save the World." How we can do this from places like here in Beaver County. So, Dr. Abt, just quickly here for us, are there public health impacts, both nationally and locally, of domestic nuclear power plants that you could share or shed light
Yeah, they're
on
all
for us?
positive. The 20% or so of our power that is produced by nuclear plants is pollution-free. That's huge, right? We've got about a third of our power produced by coal plants that have clear and present human health dangers. If we shifted from nuclear power to fossil fuel, that number of 10,000 premature deaths would go up by maybe 6,000. That's a lot. And so it's pretty clear to me that I teach in a business school, so I believe in looking at the economics of things. It's really less expensive to keep something going that you have than it is to build anything new. And I'm a big proponent of building new wind, new solar. That's great. And I'd love if we kept building wind, it's going up linearly, and if we kept building solar, it's going up exponentially. By the year 2030, if we do that and keep our nuclear plants, we'll go from a third of our power pollution-free to a little over half pollution-free. That's great. If we lose our nuclear, we're in deep trouble.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you very much. And now we'll turn to my colleague, Bill Foster from the great state of Illinois, which has had a lot of success in supporting and maintaining its fleet of domestic nuclear reactors. And Representative Foster, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman Lamb, and thank you to our witnesses. You know, I'd also like to mention that it was supposed to be that there would be two more of our colleagues here, the chairman of the full committee, Eddie Bernice Johnson, and a representative from California. And when the thunderstorms came through, they just couldn't make their schedules work. But the three of us drove in the middle of the night last night because of the importance of this hearing. We've gone through this, as you mentioned, in Illinois, where we've been struggling with the survival of our nuclear fleet, and we've resolved that favorably in terms of preserving the nuclear things. And to make that happen, we had the Republican governor and the Democratic legislature come together and recognize the importance of that, to the environment and to the workforce of the state. And you sort of have a mirror image situation here in the politics, but the logic is the same. And one of the reasons I know that I came was to show support for what I hope, all of the elected officials of Pennsylvania will come through on this. I also want to echo something that Chairman Lamb said about Shippingport. I'm a PhD physicist. I spent most of my career designing and building giant particle accelerators. And there are a handful of legendary places in the history of physics. One of them is Stagg Field on the campus of the University of Chicago, where the first nuclear chain reaction took place during World War II. Another one is the Trinity site in Alamogordo, where the first nuclear weapon was tested. And a third place on that list is Shippingport, where the power of the atom was shown that to be able to be turned for good at commercial scale. With tremendous benefits for humanity and for the environment. And so you should be proud forever that is going to be in the science textbooks forever, what was accomplished here more than 50 years ago. And as I say, we've been struggling in Illinois with preserving our nuclear fleet. And so I guess my question to actually all the members of the committee, what do you see as similar and different to the situation that Illinois faced when it decided that it had to take action and successfully took action to extend the life of its nuclear reactor fleet? Yeah, Dr. Lyons?
If I may start, Representative Foster, certainly thank you for your question, and thank you for the leadership that your state has shown in this issue. I mentioned that I was co-chairman of the American Nuclear Society Nuclear in the States Special Committee. There were members from our committee who testified in Illinois at the time of the considerations for preserving your plants. To my knowledge, the situations are virtually identical. Maybe I'm missing a nuance, but I see the situations between where Pennsylvania is today and where Illinois was a few years ago as virtually the same. Maybe I'm missing a nuance, but I don't see it.
And any other comments? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll comment to bring in a point that hasn't really been discussed here, which is what the plants are doing. So at the same time as there's challenges from the market and maybe a changing price that can be obtained for electricity, on the other side of that equation is what it costs to generate that electricity. And the plants that operate in Illinois and in Pennsylvania have been working with the industry across the U.S. To look for opportunities to reduce the cost of producing electricity. There was an industry-wide effort over the last several years called Delivering the Nuclear Promise, aimed at that. And EPRI's been engaged in that from the perspective of where technology can be applied to reduce those costs. So the staff at the plants is committed to finding a way to make it sustainable as well.
I guess I'd like to also to touch on the economics. It seems like the big dog in here is competition from low-priced natural gas, and that's really what's made things tough, certainly in Illinois, and I suspect here as well. And there are serious questions of whether we appropriately price the societal cost of methane, particularly fugitive methane emissions. That if you actually appropriately looked at what Dr. Abt mentioned, the health consequences of polluting power of various kinds, as well as the ecological damage from fugitive methane emissions. And we put a price not only on carbon, but on methane and other pollution sources, that the economics would be pretty much turned on its head, and nuclear would look very different in that economic. And Dr. Abt, do you want to?
Sure. Economists like to call these things unpriced externalities, is their fancy word for it. But it basically means if you're not paying the full costs of something, then it's not priced appropriately. And for coal-fired power plants, for pollutants such as sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, nitrous oxide, which applies to both coal and gas plants, we had a great Republican idea in 1990, the Clean Air Act amendments, of capping those pollutants and letting companies trade among them under that cap. That resulted in a great market price for those pollutants. If we properly price the fugitive methane emissions, which of course not only are very potent greenhouse gases, 30 times more potent than CO2 pound for pound, but also cause local here and now ecological damages, then an economist would pat us on the back and say we've done the right thing.
Well, thank you, and I guess my time is up, so I'll yield back balance.
And Admiral, if you want to address that last point, go right ahead.
If I could just pile on a little bit here. From my view, the challenge here is that the electric companies, I don't think, properly value nuclear energy. And the reality is, I believe, the same in Illinois, it's the same in Pennsylvania, in my original home state of New Jersey, which just enacted legislation to help the power plants in that state. And that is that people see what's close and in front of them, and they see the availability of abundant quantities of gas, and it's very inexpensive compared to other things in the way it used to. But the big picture here is that the base load availability of nuclear generated power, not subject to the time of day as solar or the variances of the wind, but it's steady and it's available 24 hours a day. It's not polluting. It gives you phenomenal resilience. So in the wintertime, in these northern states, I think you may remember that when the temperature plunges, electricity demand goes skyrocketing, and the folks are scurrying around looking for sources of energy. And they're not going to get it the way it's available in the nuclear way. You've got to go find the fuel. These nuclear plants have years of fuel on site. They don't have to go truck stuff in or pipe it in. It's there and available. So I think the real issue in each of the states is leadership. The leaders have to see beyond the near-term things, look at the long-term good and the common good for all the people, and take appropriate action. So I think it's the same in every one of our states.
Thank you, Admiral. Now we'll recognize Representative Sean Caston, also from Illinois, and I should mention that Representative Caston, Representative Stevens, and myself are all in our very first full term in Congress. So we are focusing on this issue early and hope to stay with it for a very long time. And Representative Caston, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lamb, who, in fairness, is a redshirt freshman. The rest of us are true freshmen. I really want to thank you for pulling this hearing together. I want to thank all the witnesses. Thank you for your leadership. I'm a 20-year energy executive consultant. Spent 16 years as the CEO of clean energy companies. And I can say with a high degree of certainty that we face two existential threats as a species. One of them is global warming, and the other one is Russian nukes. And this panel could not be more important because it touches on both of those. And if we don't figure out how to deal with those, we're not going to leave the kind of planet for our kids that our parents left for us. So thank you all for showing up and for dedicating not just your day, but your careers to those issues. I want to focus a little bit away from the operation of these plants to how we build more of them. Because if you recognize that those are the two big threats we face, the question is, first, how do we keep the assets running? And then second, how do we build more? Because the fact that we're hitting all these at the end of the life, to some degree, reflects the fact that we've been unable to build them to any meaningful degree over the last 4 decades. And I want to start, because I'm a chemical engineer by training, with the energy efficiency end of this cycle, because it's where my brain naturally goes. And Dr. Lyons, if you could help me out, of the total energy that comes into the fuel in a nuclear power plant, when we take it out afterwards, when we remove the campaign, what % of the total recoverable energy in that nuclear fuel have we used to make electric power?
It's an extremely small number. It's of the order of 1 or 2% that has been of the potential. If I'm answering your question, I want to be sure I'm answering the right question. If you're asking of the potential energy that could be available from the fissionable material coming into the electrical output, it is only in the range of a couple of percent.
So could you then compare what percent of the energy we're recovering in a plant like the Beaver Valley plant we just toured to the percent at sort of the best-in-class facilities around the world? What's the, how does that 1 to 2% change?
For all operating nuclear power plants, with the exception of a couple of fast reactors in Russia, the number would be about the same. They are light water. All the remaining plants are, a few exceptions, are light water plants doing roughly the number I described. Now, there are improvements coming in the future that would dramatically change that number. But for the current generation of light water plants, that would be the correct statement.
Okay, so for the new technologies coming down the path, what are we talking about that potential increase?
You can look at it in two different ways. A plant like Beaver Valley is about 35% efficient in converting heat energy to electricity. Some of the advanced plants under consideration will change that 35% up to over 50% because they are much higher temperature operation plants. In addition, there are other classes of reactors that can essentially reuse the spent fuel. Right now, we use a so-called open cycle, a once-through cycle, where fuel is used once, and right now it goes in pools and dry casks, and I pray someday we get our act together on waste management. But there are reactor designs that have been demonstrated in this country, the so-called fast reactors, that can reuse that used fuel. And then you're up to extractions that are approaching 100%, certainly above 90.
Okay, so if you could help me put this in context, we use about 4 trillion kilowatt hours a year of electricity in the country, somewhere between, a little less than 1 trillion come from nuclear, if I'm doing my math right. If we could recover the energy in those spent fuel and get down to what is theoretically possible, what percent of U.S. electricity could we generate from nuclear fuel?
Well, in principle, you could go to 100%, sir, but I would come back to my argument on diversity. I don't think you want to have 100% of any energy source.
Understood. My point is simply that if I'm following the math right,
Your math is correct.
we have enough energy that is currently, effectively going to waste as we reject this heat into the atmosphere, that is zero carbon, that is clean, that is theoretically base loaded. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds to me like if we can figure out how to deploy the capital, we have largely solved one of the major existential challenges that we face as a country.
And there are certainly companies in the United States today. There's estimated to be over 50 companies exploring advanced reactors in this country. A number of them are focused on reactors of the type about which you're asking. One of the most public or well-known is Bill Gates and TerraPower. Yeah. And that is exactly the focus of TerraPower. And I believe Mr. Gates has used some of your words on the existential threat which he is trying to address.
Well, I'm out of my time, but I want to follow up on the economics of this in the next one, but I will yield back my negative time.
Thank you very much, and we'll start a second round. I'm going to start at the other end here with Dr. Abt. And actually, Dr. Abt, I wanted to ask you something from your personal experience. As I mentioned, you're a former astronaut. You did, I believe, 4 space shuttle missions, including some missions with allied countries like Japan and Russia. So this isn't so much about nuclear energy specifically, but more about the importance of how our government makes a commitment to science and scientific research and scientific leadership in the world. From your experience coming up through NASA, seeing what it's like to train to that degree to do something incredibly risky and dangerous like go into space and to work with other countries to do it, do you see a parallel in why we have to maintain our nuclear fleet, our nuclear science, and especially the people who make up that fleet in order to have leadership in the world and be able to continue that culture that we've built all those years?
Chairman Lam, that's a superb observation. When we went to the moon, now 50 years ago, that was a bipartisan commitment that stretched over a decade from the time that we were shocked in October of 1957 when the Russians launched Sputnik 1 to when we landed on the moon on July 20th of 1969. Those kind of decade-long commitments are critical to doing science and engineering projects of all sorts. One of the things that we don't have is a commitment where a vendor can go out and say, okay, I'm going to build a big new press that can make the top of a nuclear reactor vessel. We don't have that in this country anymore because there hasn't been the demand for it.
Right.
And there hasn't been the demand for it because we don't have consistent decade-long commitments. And so you're exactly right. That kind of stuff will help in lots of things. Infrastructure of all sorts requires the length of commitment that President Eisenhower did for the interstate highway system, that President Kennedy did for the moon project. Those sorts of things are absolutely critical.
And that type of commitment would actually allow us to build a lot more of this equipment and material here in the United States instead of buying it overseas like we have to do a lot of times now.
Yeah, and part of the reason why we had trouble building the two nuclear power plants that are still under construction, Plant Vogtle in the south, is that we didn't know how to build big things here very well. The same design, the Westinghouse AP1000, got built in China with our plans much quicker because they still build large stuff. If we have infrastructure commitments, then companies will naturally start building the big forges. We'll start understanding how to do big projects again, and we won't have the time and cost overruns that we see when you do this once every 2 generations.
That's exactly right. And Admiral Fallon, I was hoping you could touch on that too. You mentioned a little bit about the importance for our influence in the world, these overseas opportunities to build plants, and the way that Russia is doing it now. And if I'm correct, Russia not only builds them, but they'll also operate them for many of these countries. So it's actually Russian scientists and businesses that are benefiting from all this. You've spent a lot of your career overseas working with foreign governments, working with foreign business leaders. Can you talk about why it's important for us to be in that game and building those plants?
Sure, it's even more than that, Mr. Chairman. So the Russians and the Chinese construct, and they own and they operate these plants. And they're paid for typically with long-term loans at interesting interest rates, but effectively what happens is the providing country dominates these, particularly the places in Africa and Asia that can least afford this, and they've got them very beholden to them. And so the people in these countries want electric power like everybody does. And you know what happens here, turn off the power and we fall apart. So in these countries, they're very eager to get it, but it's coming at a tremendous price. And the influence that Russia and China are beginning to have in these places is overwhelming, and we're just becoming irrelevant. And it's very important, I believe, for U.S. leadership to be able to have something behind the talk, to be able to stand up and do it. And so Eisenhower's initiative to use atomic power in those days, nuclear power, for peaceful purposes, to provide a need that everybody in the world wanted, I think was terrific, and we've just kind of lost that now. And if I could for a minute, I want to make this, this is very personal for me, but my last job was the commander of all U.S. forces in the Middle East during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And as an incentive to get us to invest in research and development, to give us some opportunities to what is the primary fuel source in the world today. I would tell you that my estimation is about half of our casualties, killed and wounded, in Iraq and Afghanistan, were directly related to our need to truck fuel and water in to operate our facilities in these countries. A staggering number of casualties. These are our people, our soldiers, Marines, sailors, and airmen. This is absolutely unnecessary, in my opinion. We can do better. And this is one of what I think the primary, a significant motivation ought to be at a national scale in this country to motivate the kind of research development that can give us alternatives. And I'm convinced that we can do it. We've done it before. We have a lot more knowledge today and computing power we never had before. We need to put it to work, but it's going to take leadership, and hopefully, I thank you for this hearing and for going through the travails of travel to get here to put this on, but it's very, very important for the country.
Thank you. Go ahead, Dr. Lyons.
May I just add one point to what the Admiral just said? When the Russians talk about build, own, operate, for many countries that they're offering this to, it also includes, oh, by the way, we will provide all of your fuel and we will take back all of your used fuel. It is an absolutely complete package. When they offer this to a country like Bangladesh, they're not offering it because Bangladesh has a bunch of nuclear experts. They're offering it with the idea that they are controlling the energy supply of Bangladesh for the next century.
Thank you. And with that, I recognize Representative Stevens for another round of questions.
Great. Well, it's evident that we are built for moments like these. And while I certainly don't like to hear the examples of being squirrels chasing their own tail in terms of why we're in the place that we are in, if you reverse it on its head and look at it, we are in a position where we can seize hold of why we are here. And so the questions I would like to ask, and maybe each of you could kind of chime in, is why are we here as it pertains to nuclear energy and the threats to the cuts and the plant closures? How do we, maybe in an existential way, seek to solve it? Thinking big is great. And then if you could also touch on ways in which your current portfolio of work is helping to solve this, or some examples that you might have, that would be great.
Let me start by picking up on your word portfolio. Anybody who looks at fluctuations in any markets, stock markets or anything else, knows that you have to put your bets on a lot of different numbers on the roulette wheel, because you don't know what's going to come up. We're that way with gas. You're at ground zero of the shale gas revolution in this part of the world, and gas is produced here in enough quantities that's driven the price way down. That's great. But I'm an old guy. Look at those gray hairs. And I remember that 10, 12 years ago, the price of gas went up from $3 to $12 in a matter of months. Right? Those things happen with commodities. And one way to look at the nuclear fleet is a hedge against those kind of price spikes. Now, like in any hedge, there is a risk premium that you have to pay. When Southwest Airlines hedged their fuel costs a decade ago for their jetliners, and thereby avoided the price spikes that almost killed other airlines, they had to pay a small risk premium for that. I think that's a robust lesson out of economics that we ought to learn in our power system.
Diversified industries.
So I would say one of the reasons we're here now is that the current options to build a new nuclear plant are very large, long-term, expensive plants. We only really have, one type of option right now. And a decision to invest that kind of money to build a plant requires looking ahead an 80-year, future. What is the value of that going to be in 80 years? So that has made it very difficult. There was the birth of the nuclear renaissance, where we were going to build a lot of plants. In fact, I think 14 plants have received licenses, or sites have received licenses from the NRC, and then the economy changed and things slowed down, electric growth slowed down. So I see that as a current challenge today to any company right now to invest, essentially their full market capitalization in a large project with an uncertain future is very difficult. But the good news is that all of the work going on in the SMR space and the advanced reactor space is really aimed at countering kind of the economy of scale that led to the attractiveness of these large plants, with looking at the benefits of small, where you can build things in more incremental more incremental stages and capture the value. So I think some of the way we work ourselves through this and out of this is to accelerate the development of the next wave of technologies. There are a ton of opportunities for that. There are some things that are already working very well in how the government is helping to accelerate the efforts of private investors who are developing some of these. And I think the example of the NuScale progress and the potential UAMPS plant at the Idaho National Lab is a great example of things that can be done together with industry and government to accelerate the future.
Well, and one thing I read is that China and Korea are building nuclear power plants at a sixth of the cost that it takes. And I don't know if that has to do with supply chain or, and if that leads to you, Admiral, go.
I would, before I turn it over, I would just say I think part of that is what was already mentioned, that they're in the habit of building very large projects, so they've got the skills, capability, and workforce to do that.
To answer that specific question, the reason that they claim to build these at a fraction of the cost is because they're state subsidized. And so the national investment by the Chinese government and the Russian government, they're huge. And so that makes it extremely difficult for our companies right now to compete on it's not a level playing field, not even close. And so that's probably the biggest reason why you see this tremendous growth from these two entities.
Maybe just to follow a little bit on what Ms. Taylor said, I strongly concur that the small modular reactors, the SMRs, are very likely to be the most attractive option for construction in the near term in this country. The very large plants, the gigawatt class plants like are being built at the Vogtle plant in Georgia today, there are few places in the country today, given our well-developed grid, where you need that much power all at once. But there are places where the small modular reactors will make a lot more sense. And you mentioned already the construction that is planned in Idaho. But if you look abroad, the situation may be very, very different. There are many, many places around the world where gigawatt class plants make a lot of sense, and probably a lot of them. So we need to be looking at opportunities abroad for designs like our AP1000, like our ESBWR from GE, to move ahead in the markets for gigawatt plants. And then there's any number of countries where their grids are just starting, where they couldn't possibly take a gigawatt plant. Their whole grid isn't a gigawatt, but they could take a small modular reactor. And so I see globally a tremendous market and opportunity for the United States in both large and small. In the United States, I think most of our options in the future will be the SMRs that Ms. Taylor suggested.
Well, it's an American leadership moment, and I continue to hold on to something that the Admiral said, which is that, as it compares to the global indicators, we almost feel inferior. But as I sit up here with your congressman, by the way, Mr. Connor Lamb, you have a leader in him. And again, I'd just like to recognize his efforts. I don't forget the minute he came up to me the moment he came up to me on the House floor and passed me an invitation to come here today. And it's particularly special because Beaver County is on my way home. Normally I fly, but it's the midway point. So I'm just 4 hours west of you all here, about 280 miles, and I think we'll be able to continue this dialogue and continue to seize the opportunity and moment before us. Yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you. Representative Foster.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to just spend a moment talking about the nuclear navy, because it's sort of unique. The nuclear deterrent of our country relies on three legs: the intercontinental ballistic missiles, the strategic air bombing, and also our nuclear submarines that go off in the deep ocean and hide where they cannot be detected, and because they cannot be detected, they cannot be destroyed. When the president is faced with a decision whether to launch weapons, the horrible situation that he or she could be put in is having to decide whether to push our button in response to an enemy attack of uncertain nature. And so in the case of our land-based systems and the strategic bombing, we face the possibility that our forces could be wiped out because the enemy knows where they are. and how to get them. That is not the case of nuclear submarines, and it's unique. It means that we can hold back, and we can decide when to counterpunch at a time of our choosing, and not be panicked into a nuclear war that will destroy the world. So they're what's referred to as stabilizing. And the nuclear submarine force is something, if you had to choose between these three legs, there is no question the one that you would keep would be the nuclear submarines. And so it's for that reason that I've been proud to have visited the facility in West Virginia where the nuclear fuel is made. And the place is down in Naval Yards, very near the Capitol, where a lot of the very highly classified and brilliant design work is done on those. And so if we lose the commercial nuclear business in this country, it will make our submarines much more expensive, but we will still have to build them. And so it's a false economy to think that, oh, we can just, let the Koreans, let the Japanese, let the Chinese and Russians do the commercial stuff, and we'll just continue building our subs. Because of the shared workforce that's represented by many of you in this room, I think it's essential that we preserve, for national security reasons alone, a strong commercial nuclear capability. And if you have anything to add to that,
Like you've said it all. The submarines are the most survivable aspect of our nuclear deterrent. And again, the idea is that they, because they're going to be very, very difficult to find and detect, that this survivability is our deterrent against somebody that might think that they could neutralize us, take out our strategic capability, and thereby blackmail us into whatever they wanted to do. So it's really important. I believe that the options in the supply chain are not only shrinking dramatically, but in some cases, I've been told we're down to one supplier in this country to provide absolutely critical components for the Navy nuclear power program. And the reason is because there's just not an opportunity to diversify and do things economically. So couldn't agree more. Thank you, Congressman.
Well, thank you. And also, one of the things that I know all of us are going to be very active on in the Science Committee is looking at advanced nuclear designs, because of the real promise that is there, that's recognized both commercially and in the Department of Energy. For example, just the spent fuel that's sitting there in storage in the pond, in the dry cask storage there, is enough to operate this plant in principle for more than 100 years, just with the fuel that's sitting there in the ground today. And that opportunity is one that we have to understand how we're going to take advantage of it. Where it is frankly a disgrace of Congress that we haven't dealt with the nuclear waste problem. We have this thing called Yucca Mountain, and a promise that was given that we would accept nuclear waste in a facility, and for various political reasons that we have not followed through on that. One of the ways out of that politically is these advanced designs, the designs that can burn the nuclear energy that's still stored in the spent fuel. And I was wondering if any of you do you have a favorite design, Ms. Taylor, or just an idea for a way forward on making sure that we actually follow through on that promise?
Well, I don't have a favorite design, but I'm absolutely impressed by the group of young people that are working on all sorts of designs, several of which have this concept of somehow burning the current used fuel. And working through the technology part of that is a challenge, but the uncertainty about how one would go about doing that, if that would ever be legal, if the framework would be in place to use that fuel, is a large uncertainty to anybody looking to invest in those technologies today. So I think that's an important aspect.
From a technological point of view, when one of those is demonstrated, is there any reason that it could not be sited on an existing location such as here?
I don't think there's any technical reason why it couldn't be.
Yeah, Dr. Lyons?
May I just add, sir? There are certainly no technical obstacles to the vision that you described. In my mind, the decision that I hope this country will eventually make will be between an open cycle where we are now and a closed cycle, as you just described, where you continue to process, reprocess, and reuse the fuel. My guess is that this will be done on an economic basis, and that I don't know how to answer the question from either an open or closed cycle now. We have yet to show that we can open a repository in this country, so I don't have the foggiest idea what that costs. And these advanced designs and the reprocessing that would have to go with it, we also have not done a complete demonstration in order to understand the costs. I believe the country is committed, at least by law now, to move to the open cycle and show we can open a repository. I hope we can. I'm not sure it will be Yucca, but maybe. But in any case, we're on this path of an open cycle. I would like very much to see us also explore the path of what could the economics be of a closed cycle, so that the country could make an intelligent decision sometime in the future of, do we want to stay with the open or move to a closed cycle? And there are many potential advantages to going with a closed cycle, but the economics are uncertain in both cases.
Yeah, and I agree, but I think it's important that economic calculation consider both the national security aspects and the necessity of keeping a strong nuclear enterprise going in this country, as well as the secondary environmental damage when you start providing that energy with fossil fuels. And so
If I may, let me just say that it's a privilege to be on a panel with a former NRC commissioner, and one of our graduates, Bill Magwood, was also on the NRC.
Very good friend.
But I have to say, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is stretched so thin that their ability to do the kind of oversight of these clean sheet of paper designs is in question. And that's one of the reasons why TerraPower, that we talked about before, is looking at licensing abroad. I don't want to see that. What I do want to see is additional resources in the NRC to be able to license and test those designs in the United States of America.
Thank you, and I will now recognize Representative Caston.
Thank you, Chairman. As promised, I want to follow up on some of the economic barriers to capital deployment in this space, but I want to start by singing the praises of economics, because I think a very compelling case can be made that the single most important thing we did for CO2 emissions in my professional lifetime was the 1992 Energy Policy Act. The actually creating an incentive where people preferentially operated their lowest cost sources has been a boon to the nuclear industry. You know, the fleet has gone from 60% to 90% capacity factor. I think the First Energy folks told me this morning that you're running 93% capacity factor at the upper end of the tier. And you know, you're doing that because you got good people, you're doing that because you're motivated by the right things, and you're also doing it because you're greedy. Because if you can make money by operating more hours, you operate more hours, and that's a good thing. Now, having said that, the pernicious side effect of that is that over the course of deregulation, there's a saying that's crept into the energy world that everybody wants to be the third owner of a power plant, and nobody wants to be the first owner. And my question for you, Dr. Apt, is, you know, at a broad level, what have we done wrong? But more specifically, is there a market tool that we can use to actually encourage the deployment of new capital in the energy sector? Or do we have to go back and look at, you know, we knew how to build stuff in the old regulated model. We didn't know how to make the right dispatch decisions all the time. But capacity markets, are they working? Can we tweak them to work? What are your thoughts about how we might learn from the last 20 years of history to better deploy new capital in this space?
So the technology changes that have happened in the electric power industry have been largely stimulated by two things. One has been command and control regulation for conventional pollutants. If you look at the level of patents for things like sulfur dioxide and particulate matter control, you know, people hadn't done many patents until the 1970 Clean Air Act and especially the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments came in, and then the patents went way up. So one of the things that we do right is to have federal and state regulations that stimulate people to go in their lab and figure out a new piece of technology. The second, as you mentioned, is competition. That's why we brought in natural gas generators, The power companies had built all coal all the time until restructuring happened, and then people said, well, we can build a natural gas plant for a fifth of the cost in 2 years instead of 8 years, and that happened. But the other thing is to have stimulation of low pollution sources explicitly, renewable portfolio standards, for example, and the kind of low pollution standards that we have in Illinois and New York and perhaps here in Pennsylvania. Economists can argue about the nitpicky details of whether a price on carbon or an all-comers for all low pollution standards are best, or whether you should have tiers, as in Pennsylvania, for the Advanced Energy Portfolio Standard, where one tier is renewables and another tier might be nuclear. The difference between doing any of those and doing nothing at all is immense.
So let me ask you, because you're very humble about your background, but I know you know that I know that you've been really one of the leading thinkers on figuring out how to get rid of some of these inefficiencies in the system. And so if we presume for a moment that the four of us on this side of the dais have the authority to deputize you as king of the energy system for a day or two, if we get to pick three things that if you make those changes, we will cause a greater deployment of capital in clean energy technology, using market tools. Where do you see the low-hanging fruit? What's your top three?
Clearly, you have to first re-examine your question of whether they should all be market tools. The issue with market tools is they lead you to short-term answers. And so you have the dash to gas, as it was called. Everybody built gas plants around the time when gas first became available and the Energy Information Agency was saying the prices would stay low. And that's what drove, around the year 1999 and 2001, 60 gigawatts per year of gas was built. Had the absolutely predictable effect of driving natural gas prices up by a factor of 4. Right? So markets are inherently short-term. One of the things that we can do is to say, well, where are market tools appropriate, and where should you have things like a low pollution standard, or if you like, a renewable portfolio standard. Again, we're not running out of fossil fuels, so renewability in itself is not our goal. What we're running out is atmosphere in which to put the combustion products of fossil fuels. So low pollution should be the goal. And you can have regulations of various types that put in low pollution. An absolute market solution would be a price on pollutants, including greenhouse gases. That's not likely to happen, and it's cumbersome when it does happen. Waxman-Markey, I testified about some years ago, a decade ago, in front of a number of committees, and it got pretty complex, more complex than I expected it to get. I think that a kind of portfolio of command and control regulation for pollutants, opening up a window for low pollution sources, including renewables and nuclear, and then keeping an idea that we ought to have a portfolio, or the three things that I would do.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Okay, and we'll do one final round, just kind of for parting shots, make sure everyone gets a chance to finish off here. I don't think I'm going to take the full 5 minutes, but I just wanted to flesh out the jobs issue a little bit more, because it's been referred to by several of our witnesses. We've had the chance to talk about the folks that work here at Beaver Valley, that work for First Energy, that are represented by their locals here today, many of them veterans. Extremely important for us to protect those jobs. There is also a wider jobs issue for us here in Pennsylvania, and I have with me here a report by the Energy Futures Initiative that looks at the companies in the nuclear supply chain and where they're located and how many of them there are. It's been referred to a few times that some of these companies sell equipment both to nuclear power stations like Beaver Valley and to the U.S. Navy, and that it's very important for the future of the Navy's nuclear program that these companies survive, because they need to buy their stuff from them. But if they're not able to also sell to Beaver Valley because Beaver Valley closes down, then some of those companies might close down. And then all of a sudden, the Navy is stuck when it comes to buy what they need. And it turns out that Pennsylvania is actually one of the leaders in this area. So if you look at the states that have the highest number of nuclear supply chain companies, we're actually number one. We have 71 nuclear supply chain companies here in the state of Pennsylvania. They offer about 655 different types of products. Really important things when it comes to valves, boilers, storage containers, pumps, concrete. I mean, the things that make up the power station that we know. And we are, again, a huge leader when it comes to having companies that do business both with Beaver Valley and with the U.S. Navy. There are really big companies like Bechtel and Westinghouse and General Electric are some of the examples that you'd probably be familiar with, but that actually goes all the way down the line to smaller companies too. And so I wanted to highlight that because that's one of the things that it's at stake. If we're trying to support our national security and make sure that the Navy can be a leader in nuclear going forward, they need these companies to survive. Just like our communities need the companies to survive too, because people work there. Admiral Fallon, I think you're pretty familiar with this issue from your time in the Navy, but also some of the work you've done on the outside. You know about the Energy Futures Initiative and this report. Is that a fair description that I've just given of the issue as it faces the Navy?
Sure. There are dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of companies all over this great nation of ours that provide bit and piece support for the big names. So Westinghouse, Bechtel, whatever there are untold bits and pieces that are essential for the equipment to operate correctly. And those are often overlooked. People don't pay attention to them, except at the local level when people are actually employed. And so it's very important. And the Navy tries to encourage companies to diversify, to spread it out for reasons of redundancy and common sense, and also to appeal pretty blatantly to the Congress to support things because it has a direct impact on people in their district. So I don't know all the details of it, but I can tell you that the general practice is to encourage companies to have a number of suppliers to give you an option economically, and also to encourage the kind of support that we need at the top.
Great, thank you, and I'll turn now to Representative Stevens.
Great. I referenced the article from Pinker, Steven Pinker, who's a thinker, right? I didn't mean for that to rhyme, but he's a psychologist. And in his article, I just want to make reference to this. He said, in talking about nuclear energy, he said, despite its demonstrable safety, nuclear power presses several psychological buttons. And then he goes on to list what those buttons are, the risks that people associate, some of the shock around what, comes with maybe thoughts around radiation, of which Dr. Apt said we don't have any negative health effects. In fact, we only have health benefits. We have steam bellowing from the tower, which is great. And he also mentioned that people feel better about eliminating a single tiny risk entirely than minimizing a risk from all hazards combined. And since we have a panel of experts and we have jobs that we want to keep because they're full of technical talent and industrial might, and Beaver County has got a lot in common with Oakland County, Michigan, Western Wayne County, Michigan, where I represent. I'm wondering if you, from your knowledge standpoint, if you could just maybe make any mention of awareness that you have with these local efforts around nuclear technology adoption, and also, as we've talked about, some of the new plants and the opportunities for what we can create. Who's raising their hand first? I mean, who's putting? Michigan, obviously, we've adapted some of this. We've put into play. We've preserved a couple of our plants. We've had this discussion around what this means for our regional economy. But we want to create more plants. We don't want to just save the one that's here. We want to create more. So what's happening at the local level? Congress has got a role to play here. Okay, we legislate. We should do, by the way, all of our hearings in the field. I love this. Get us out of the swamp. Let's keep coming in here. But yet, really, and I know we got some local leaders in the room, if you really want to get something done, you got to start from the bottom up. your mayors, your township supervisors, your state officials, who's putting their hand up from what you've seen? And in any other, points around how we can kind of push back against these psychological issues. Dr. Lyons.
Let me just take a crack at a few responses, and I'm sure my colleagues can add a lot more. A number that sticks in my mind is that the average safety of workers at a nuclear power plant is roughly comparable to the safety of workers in an office environment, which is at least an interesting factoid that many people may not know. I think one of the important ways of publicizing the safety of nuclear power plants is to remember that all the workers at those plants live in that vicinity, and the resident inspectors from the NRC are right there in those plants, living with their families in that community. And I think that is part of the last point I would like to make, that when there are surveys of the acceptability of nuclear power in different localities around the country, the numbers are astronomically high in places, frankly, where people know what they're talking about. When those surveys are done in communities like this, I don't know the details, but I would assume that here it's like other similar communities. People understand nuclear power, they understand the incredibly low risks, and they understand the incredible safety of these plants. The approval ratings, if you will, to expand and continue nuclear in most communities like this is in the 80-90% levels.
Yeah, great. Continue to do it from the bottom up. Did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I'll give you, share an anecdote. So a number of years ago, I was appearing before a different panel in Washington on the other side of the green felt table. And I was becoming irritated. I was younger, had some hair in those days, and I was really grinding my teeth because some of the witnesses were spouting absolute, complete falsehoods. And it was just kept coming on and coming on, and I was just...
That's the first
so finally, Chairman said, all right, Admiral, what do you have to say about that? So I was very impertinent, and I said, Mr. Chairman, in my business, we deal in facts, and I haven't heard many tonight. Ooh, big mistake. So the chairman leapt across the table and put his finger close to my chest and said, let me tell you something, Admiral. Up here, we deal in perceptions, and the perceptions you guys are screwed up and you've done that. So I try to learn from that, and I think this is a really good example that you bring up.
Well, I'm going to make... Go ahead.
No, so we have these perceptions out there. So it's kind of like back to the 1940s, early 50s, atomic. That thing, you're going to glow. I can remember joking in the first days of Navy nuclear power. We'd say on the guys on the ship, hey, you're starting to glow. I saw you last night. It's a joke. But people have these ideas, and they're perceptions. So how do you take on the perceptions? And my experience is that you take them on by being smart, learning, having the facts, but then you have to communicate and explain to people the reality of the way things are. And I think your comments, Dr. Lyons, are right on. People that live and work around these plants for decades. I lived on nuclear-powered ships, slept up 50 feet off the reactors for months and years on end. Many, many days. I'm still here. I'm not glowing too badly, am I? But I think we need to really make an effort to do that, and it's something that people are beginning to get concerned now. I see governors and other people in the states are recognizing they're being backed up against a wall because these things may go away. Now what are we going to do, folks? So they're kind of getting it, and I think hopefully they'll start to work down at the local level, but I believe that a very useful role for you, and I commend again your willingness to hold this hearing and come all the way out here to do this, is to try to put in place policies at the national level that will enable things to happen. And so incentivizing the R&D. I mean, this country is phenomenal. Look at the things. Look at Dr. Abt, a decade ago, the hand-wringing over the space program. Oh my God, we're going down the tubes. We've seeded everything. We're nowhere. Well, guess what? Industry all of a sudden came out of nowhere, and they have, there's a series of rockets and airplanes and things, if you follow news, So who knows what the future is, but it's certainly turned around a lot. We can do the same thing here if the right incentives are put in place with the right policies. And there are a whole host of things, my colleagues here know this a lot better than I do, that are in place that are de-incentivizing people to take the reasonable risks that are necessary, I think, to give us a future. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll add a couple thoughts. I agree with you that it's extremely difficult for anyone to understand risk and compare risks of things. I myself am, I know, irrationally afraid of snakes, though there's no data to support that. But I have seen over the course of my career a big shift from strong opposition to nuclear power to now strong support that's growing. You know, it's becoming more widespread. I think two things are going on that are accelerating that and may be useful to further leverage. One is the change in the view from the environmental community, from nuclear waste being a dangerous thing and concern about used fuel, to recognizing the environmental friendliness of nuclear and the potential large role nuclear can play in decarbonization. And the other thing that I've seen is a real fueling of interest from young people, people who are in school right now. I think there was a big success when the DOE decided to invest a lot of its research in universities, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago. Pete, you may have been responsible for that, actually. We're now seeing these people who are out of college 5 years, 10 years, leading this charge in the advanced reactor space, leading the companies, actually, and challenging the rest of us who have been in the industry for a long time on the pace at which we can achieve change and ready new technologies for the industry. So I think there are challenges around communications, but I think there's a lot of hope and opportunity in the future.
Absolutely, thank you. And we have touched a little bit today, and I'm sure we will as we wrap up, on some of the proactive things that the federal government can do. But apart from, specific things like loan guarantees and working on how the licensing works and production tax credits and doubling down on research, the biggest thing we need to do is send this signal, like you're referencing, to the universities, to young people, to the market, that this industry is here to stay and that there will be nuclear plants today and nuclear plants tomorrow, so that when people want to go into business to make the supplies, or they want to choose it as their major in college, they'll do that, and there will be the pipeline there to make it all thrive and survive. Representative Foster, any parting shots?
Well, thank you, and thank you, Chairman. I guess maybe I'd like to just talk to the audience for a moment. It is not an accident that Chairman Connor Lamb was chosen, despite being only a redshirt freshman, to be the chair of the Energy Subcommittee on the Science Committee. I was a scientist most of my life. I've been in politics for about 10 years. And in that time, you learn to spot who the leaders of the future are going to be. And when you see someone who is as smart, is a good guy and a leader, like you see in him, every one of you who gets a chance to vote for him should be very, very proud that you have a representative like that. The other thing that we're doing out here is this afternoon, we're all going to be going to to NETL, the National Energy Technology Laboratory, one of the national labs. The other hat that I have on here, I'm one of the co-chairs of the National Laboratory Caucus, which is a bipartisan group to make sure that Congress fully appreciates all of the jewels in the research and development crown of this country. That locations like Shippingport are historic because of the commercial and technical significance, and also the national laboratories. NETL, which is, as you probably all know, not far from here, is absolutely crucial to not only to the jobs that it produces, but to the technological future of this country. And so I'm very proud to be a part of that as well. I guess I have one last question having to do with electrical supply and cars and electrical cars, because one of the things that make it difficult to support a very large nuclear fleet in this vicinity is that a lot of the load was for steel industries it's gone away. But this is also probably the center of the universe for self-driving cars and new technology. I know in my district we have Argonne National Lab, which is in the process of developing developing batteries that will have 5 times the range and will make electric cars, really preferable to fossil fuel powered cars. But what will that do to the need for electrical grid capacity? Dr. Abt?
So I drove here in a Chevy Volt, and we've spent a long time looking at that. Electric demand in this country went up at almost 8% a year from 1950 to 1973. So it's going up like this. Then it transitioned to growth, but linear growth. There's a big difference between exponential and linear. And then in 2007, it went flat where it stayed. And so folks are looking at what the future may bring. If we have more electric vehicles, which will help the environment, it should go up. And when it goes up, if it does transition again to growth, then keeping our existing nuclear fleet is going to be terribly important, because if that goes away and we fill in with fossil fuel, we're in deep trouble.
Oh, thank you, and thank you, Chairman Lamb, again for holding this hearing.
Thank you. Representative Caston.
Well, I'm going to be pretty brief. Thank you again, Chairman, for pulling this together, and everybody for coming. All of us on this side of the panel serve on multiple committees, but we're here in our capacity on the Science Committee, where our jurisdiction is essentially deciding what the United States should spend its research dollars in, how much of those dollars should be, and then holding people accountable in our oversight role. There's been a consistent theme on this panel about the potential for advanced nuclear technology. And, I'd start with Ms. Taylor, but just welcome your thoughts as we leave here. What specific programmatic areas would you really like to see an increased focus from the federal side, where we can really catalyze some activity? And from the electric power research industry, I imagine you're pretty close to that. What would you recommend as we take back, as we think about what we're going to fund in upcoming budget cycles?
I'll speak to a couple things. One is to recognize that there is a strong link between a lot of the research that's needed for advanced reactors and the plants that are operating today. So, for example, in the area of advanced technology fuel, we're looking at new materials that can make fuel more tolerant in the case of an accident. But then we're finding that bringing in some of the concepts from the advanced reactors of going to higher enrichment fuel, for example, can bring nearer term economic benefits to the plants today while readying the regulator, the supply chain, and the designers for the plants of tomorrow. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in that space. What are those things that can be accelerated to help accelerate the availability of advanced reactors while potentially bringing value to plants today? The adoption of all the modern technologies that are going on in the world around us to these existing plants is an area where there's big opportunity for, sensors, monitoring, data analytics, using things like drones and robotics for inspections, all help bring, better operation today and ready the future for the designers, and the regulatory aspect, which is important and probably a critical path to the commercial availability of advanced reactors.
Yeah.
I certainly agree with the comments from Ms. Taylor, but let me just add that another very strong need in this country, as you look at the advanced reactor concepts, is for testbed capabilities for those reactors. For example, I mentioned TerraPower earlier and Mr. Gates. They had to go to Russia to get some of their test capabilities because we don't operate a fast reactor in this country, a fast spectrum reactor. One of the projects that is now being seriously considered within the DOE, Congress has been, I think, very supportive, is a so-called versatile test reactor, which would be a fast reactor, and it would return, the U.S. did fast reactors, I don't know, back in at least the 50s, and we don't have an operating fast reactor today in this country. So there definitely are testbed requirements that as you look towards the advanced reactors, non-light water coolants, there's a very definite need for advanced test capabilities, which would logically be built at some of the national laboratories that have the expertise to run and operate a facility like this. But then it would be available to the vast number of advanced reactor startup companies around the country that need these test capabilities. Another partial answer.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Before we bring the hearing to a close, I just wanted to say two more thank yous. We are here in this room right now because of the kindness and generosity of the people of Shippingport who have welcomed us today. So to any Shippingport residents or local elected officials or government officials that are with us today, thank you for having us. We do have two members of local law enforcement with us in the back who've been watching over us the whole time and standing while doing so. So thank you, gentlemen, for doing that and for keeping us safe. And then finally, I wanted to recognize we have several staff members from Congress in attendance with us today, too. You can see at the table here and one behind me. They're really the people that make Capitol Hill run every day, and they made sure that this place was all set up perfectly and ready to go. They prepare us, they get us where we need to go on time, pretty much always behind the scenes. The members of my congressional office are the same way. There's several of them all across the back of the room. So I just wanted you to know the major contribution that they make in making your government work every day and making hearings like this happen day in and day out in Washington, D.C. and here. So we're very thankful to all of them for their work in getting us here and making this possible. With that, the record will remain open for 2 weeks for any additional statements by the members and for any additional questions the committee may ask of the witnesses. The witnesses are now excused with a final thank you from us for your participation, and the hearing is now adjourned.
Thank you.